There are many, of course, who would dismiss our conference as an unwelcome and undesirable event in the Reformed evangelical calendar. In fact, when the ad appeared in the British Church newspaper, it brought forth a response from a brother in Glasgow. I'll not mention his name. We're delighted to have Don and his wife with us today from Glasgow, but it's someone else who wrote from Glasgow, who was stimulated, provoked by the mere appearance of the ad. And we've had a little correspondence since then. So not everyone is excited by this conference. Generally dismissing Amyraldianism as a compromise between Arminianism and Calvinism, they fear a dilution and weakening of what they regard as Orthodox Calvinism. However, I believe that sufficient has been written within the last 4 decades, at least to demonstrate that Amyraldian theology is both a reaffirmation of Calvin's original teaching and, more importantly, a confirmation of the true message of the Word of God. Yet Amyraut continues to have a bad press. In systematic theologies and articles, his distinctive theological stance is usually misrepresented and marginalized. If you check, for example, Berkhof's systematic theology, you get that impression. As if the man had openly spurned the Reformation doctrine of justification by faith, he is, in some circles at least, having difficulty in shaking off the unflattering epithet of the grave digger of the French Reformed Church, a charge repeated as recently as 2003. For the vast majority of students of church history and Christian biography, the Huguenot Amyraut is an unknown figure compared with someone like his near contemporary, the Puritan Richard Baxter. Yet within a British historical context, Richard Baxter is generally regarded as the chief exponent of Amyraldianism. Even though at one time Baxter's doctrinal distinctives were identified as Baxterianism, he tends to be styled as an Amyraldian. Who then is the Frenchman whose teaching gave our English Baxter his theological identity? As we all should know, the Puritan is far from being a shadowy figure. His extraordinary ministry in 17th century Kidderminster is celebrated by an appropriate local statue. His nationwide influence was diffused by such still gripping page-turners as The Saints' Everlasting Rest and Call to the Unconverted. And his lovely hymn, Ye Holy Angels Bright, is still enjoyed by modern worshippers, and we'll be singing that tomorrow morning. Neither must we ignore that his colourful and dramatic life is recorded in his autobiography with its exotic Latin title, Reliquiae Baxterianae. Lastly, Baxter made a further mark on English history by his courageous stand before the infamous Judge Jeffreys in 1685. One of the accusations of Judge Jeffreys that Baxter had written a cartload of books and that it would have been good had he been whipped out of his writing trade 40 years before. Well, I can assure you that on this CD there is at least a very large box of books of Baxter, so don't fail to get hold of that. Turning to Moïse Amyraut, while he had an effective pastoral ministry, he never quite turned Saumur upside down, and this charming town in the Loire Valley exhibits no statue to commemorate him. Although he wrote a series of highly significant theological works, and there's the title page of one of them on the display there, neither did he write a devotional or evangelistic classic, neither is a little-known hymn ever sung, and lastly, there is no Reliquiae Amyraldianae to perpetuate his memory. Our ignorance is chiefly due more to prejudice than the language and culture barrier, more formidable perhaps to overcome than the geological problems faced by the builders of the Channel Tunnel. On top of the foreign nature of some features of French culture is French religion in general, and that of Huguenot history in particular. This is where an almost unknown Englishman comes to our aid. I refer to a certain John Quick, the mere mention of whose name should explain the wording of my title. In short, my paper is not a 10-minute hors d'oeuvre. My known passionate affinities with the Huguenots are due neither to Francophilia as such, nor to French Protestant ancestry. For all that my roots are English, my interests are self-consciously spiritual and theological. If any precedents are needed for my enthusiasm, I would cite such English 19th century writers as Samuel Smiles and Richard Heath, if not the American historian Henry Baird, probably of Scottish descent. All these authors wrote significant accounts of the Huguenots, especially the latter, whose comprehensive 6-volume history was published between 1880 and 1895. However, I feel a close affinity with the aforementioned English Presbyterian minister John Quick, the tercentenary of whose death falls later this very month. So we're celebrating Quick, really, as well as the thinking of Amyraut. This persecuted Puritan was the first writer to chronicle and document the Huguenot epic for English readers in an extensive manner. Being both a personally acquainted commentator on their affairs and a participant in the struggles of English nonconformity, Quick is a literary linkman and part of the broader story at the same time. So before we take a look at Quick's look at Amyraldianism, it is necessary to take a quick look at Quick. The reason for John Quick's inclusion in our story will be apparent from a sketch of his little-known life. He was born at Plymouth in 1636. After graduating at Oxford in 1657, he was ordained at Ermington in Devon in 1659. Along with his illustrious Puritan brethren, a more famous contemporary, John Flavel, ministered at nearby Dartmouth, Quick exercised a faithful and courageous ministry. He served at Kingsbridge with Church Stowe and then at Brixton near Plymouth. Undeterred by the Act of Uniformity of 1662, he continued to preach. He was arrested during the Lord's Day morning worship on the 13th of December 1663 and imprisoned at Exeter. At his trial, Quick was nearly acquitted on a technicality. However, since he refused to give up preaching, he was sent to prison. After suffering for a further 8 weeks, he was liberated by Sir Matthew Hale. The Bishop of Exeter, Seth Ward, then prosecuted Quick for preaching to the prisoners, but the Lord's servant was acquitted, his unashamed guilt notwithstanding. King Charles II's indulgence of 1672 brought a brief respite for the Puritan Brotherhood. Quick was licensed to preach at Plymouth. When restrictions were imposed again the following year, he was imprisoned for 3 months with other nonconformists at the Marshalsea prison in Plymouth. On his release, Quick left the west of England for London. He then travelled to the Netherlands, where he became a minister to the English church at Middelburg in 1679. Returning to London 2 years later, he gathered a Presbyterian congregation in a small meeting house in Middlesex Court, Bartholomew Close, Smithfield. On the eve of less troubled times, his London ministry, successful to the conversion of many, says Dr. Edmund Calamy, was relatively undisturbed. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the Toleration Act of 1689 eventually brought persecution to an end. Known as a serious good preacher with a great facility and freedom in prayer, John Quick continued to serve his people faithfully until his death on the 29th of April, 1706. So pencil that date in your diary and give thanks for this man later this month. He was buried in the Dissenters' burial ground at Bunhill Fields. His wife Elizabeth died in 1708. Their only daughter became the wife of Dr. John Evans, who completed the commentary on the Epistle to the Romans in Matthew Henry's immortal exposition. During his early ministry and subsequently, Quick became acquainted with the Huguenot refugees, some of whom landed at his native Plymouth from La Rochelle in 1681, the year the dreadful Dragonades began. Accordingly, wrote Calamy, Quick was very compassionate to those in distress, at a great deal of pains and expense for the relief of the poor French Protestants, and his house and purse were almost ever open to them. He was a perfect master of their language and had a peculiar respect for their churches upon the account of their sound doctrine and useful discipline and the noble testimony which they bore to religion by their sufferings. Consistent with his personal courage and pastoral gifts, John Quick combined scholarship with zeal for the truth. The blending of these qualities explains his authorship of a work of major Huguenot interest, the Synodicon in Gallia Reformata. And there's a facsimile of it on the table for you to browse through later. This pair of fascinating folios was published in 1692. The work chiefly consists of the proceedings of all the national synods, 29 in all, of the French Reformed churches, from the first held at Paris in 1559 to the last permitted by Louis XIV at Loudun in 1659. Besides an historical introduction, Quick included the Confession of Faith and Discipline of the French Reformed churches, together with the Edict of Nantes of 1598, and then the Edict of Fontainebleau, 1685, commonly known as the Revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Pope Innocent XI's congratulatory letter to the French king is also included, along with an account of the dreadful persecution of the immediate post-revocation period. The author's title page claim, a work never before extant in any language, not even French, is noteworthy. A French edition was later published at The Hague in 1710 by Jean Aymon. Unlike Aymon, Quick had direct access to original manuscript material borrowed from Huguenot refugees, which he then collated and translated. Aymon then retranslated Quick's work back into French, which explains his repetition of some of Quick's inaccuracies. The Synodicon remains, therefore, a primary English source for Huguenot information during the early modern period. Quick's interest in the Huguenots did not end with the Synodicon. Besides a few published sermons of his own, he also prepared for publication a selection of 50 brief, some quite lengthy, biographies of eminent pastors, theologians, and martyrs of the French Reformed churches, the Icônes Sacrées Gallicanes. He also produced a similar selection of 20 Puritans, the Icônes Sacrées Anglicanae. These ambitious ventures failed with the death in 1700 of William Russell, Duke of Bedford, the dedicatee of the Synodicon, who had offered to finance the project. Advancing illness also prevented Quick from collecting subscriptions for the work. Following the author's death, the manuscript volumes were eventually deposited at what is now known as Dr. Williams's Library in London. There they remain in their unpublished state, although, since the originals decayed with time, a transcription was made of them in the 19th century by the Reverend Hugh Hutton, M.A., minister of Churchgate Presbyterian Church, Bury St. Edmunds. The work took 3 years, from 1862 to 5, for which the then princely sum of £150 was paid. And on the table here is my photocopy of Quick's transcribed work on Amyraldianism. You might like to look at it. I've got my highlightings in it, but that is the nearest you'll get to this hitherto untapped source. This brings us to the 35th of Quick's 50 Huguenot biographies or icons, the life of Monsieur Amyraut, pastor and professor in the Church and University of Saumur. Interestingly, in the two major studies of Amyraut during the last 50 years by Dr. Brian G. Armstrong and Dr. Franz Peter van Stam, this work was neglected. While Quick's Synodicon is frequently cited, his Icônes Sacrées Gallicanes are ignored. However, biographical information is cited from Pierre Bayle's Dictionnaire historique et critique of 1696, described by Armstrong as an undervalued and underused source containing much that is still important and not readily accessible elsewhere. And there are some photocopies of that here on the corner, some selections. For information about Amyraut, Bayle states that his source was, quote, the memoirs communicated by Monsieur Amyraut the son, a source also used by Quick. However, the latter's biography includes more personal features than Bayle revealed in his dictionary. These generally unknown personal features are a vital part of this presentation of Amyraut's life. when the reference is to Monsieur Amyraut the son, I can't find anywhere what his name was. We know the name of his son because he called his little boy Moses after his father. But don't ask me what the name of Amyraut's son was. I just can't find out. His ancestors, Amyraut's ancestors, coming originally from Alsace and later Orléans, Moïse Amyraut was born in September 1596 at Bourgail in Anjou, a small town in the Loire Valley, 40 kilometers west of Tours. Provided an education in the humanities, his father sent him to study law at the University of Poitiers. Proving himself a diligent student, working daily for 14 hours, Moïse graduated licentiate after a year. Traveling home via Saumur, he visited Monsieur Bouchereau, pastor of the Reformed Church, who recognized the young man's extraordinary abilities and piety. Being introduced to the governor of Saumur, the famous Huguenot soldier, statesman, and scholar, the Lord Philippe du Plessis-Mornay, young Moïse was encouraged to abandon law and study theology. At first reluctant, his father agreed with the advice given. Studying other works by Tully, Demosthenes, and Aristotle, Moïse felt drawn to theology and the Christian ministry through reading John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. He was admitted to the Reformed Academy at Saumur, founded by Lord du Plessis-Mornay in 1599. Moïse thus came under the influence of the Scottish theologian John Cameron, who served as Professor of Theology from 1618 to 21, only 3 years. If anyone wants to complain about Amyraut, I'm afraid the Scots have a little to answer for. But of course, we're happy in that respect. Cameron had a profound influence on Moïse, who became his most famous pupil. Succeeding the Dutch Francis Gomarus at Saumur, Cameron challenged the ultra-orthodoxy of Calvin's successor Theodore Beza. Restless and outspoken, he became known as Bezae Mastix, or Basil Scourge, effectively signaling a return to the balanced biblicism of Calvin. Amyraut embraced and developed Cameron's authentic Calvinism, a via media between Arminianism and Bezaism. Such was Amyraut's admiration for Cameron that he imitated his gestures and even spoke French with a Scottish accent. Can you believe it? Little information is available about Amyraut for the year 1618 to 26. However, in 1626, he was called to succeed his lifelong friend and former fellow student, Jean Daillet, as pastor at Saumur. Having commenced his ministry in the town in 1625, Daillet, the future preacher par excellence, was called to the great Reformed temple at Charenton near Paris, where he exercised a powerful and influential ministry until his death in 1670. And that temple could hold between 7,000 and 10,000 hearers. And there's a picture of it on the cover of one of the books on the table there, to give you an idea of what it must have been like. Having authored his first major publication, a treatise concerning religions, which is the subject of our next paper from our friend and brother David, Amyraut was appointed as theology professor in the academy in 1633. He joined the learned Hebraist Louis Capel and fellow theologian Joshua de Laplace on the faculty. All three being disciples of Cameron, they exhibited a remarkable harmony, as is rarely to be met with in academic land, says Bale. Writing more quaintly, Quick states that it was commonly said of them that their 3 heads were covered with one bonnet, that is, with one and the same nightcap. Before we proceed, it is important to remember the religious and political context in which the Huguenots lived. While they were a sizable and significant minority, their liberties within Roman Catholic France were defined by the Edict of Nantes, granted during the reign of Henri IV in 1598. After decades of religious conflict, the edict guaranteed a degree of religious freedom and other public privileges. However, due to constant intrigue by the Jesuits and other Roman Catholic conservatives, the position of the Huguenots still made them vulnerable. As second-class citizens, they enjoyed a fragile and frequently violated peace. To practice the Reformed religion always demanded a combination of courage and wisdom. Throughout their public lives and ministries, the Huguenot pastors generally proved exemplary in this respect. It was during the National Synod of Charenton in 1631 that Amyraut made his initial mark. Contrary to earlier custom, the Reformed delegates from the previous National Synod of Castres presented their complaints and grievances over violations of the Edict of Nantes before King Louis XIII on their knees. They grovelled, rather. Determined to honour the king, yet maintain their privileges as servants of Christ, Amyraut insisted that he would address his majesty standing. Thus, commissioned by the synod, so he did. In fact, so impressive was Amyraut's demeanour in the whole matter, his courage, manners, and integrity won him the esteem of Cardinal Richelieu. Amyraut is chiefly remembered for setting the cat among the pigeons over the theology of predestination. When a Roman Catholic nobleman, otherwise sympathetic to the Reformed faith, expressed doubts about what he perceived to be Calvin's teaching, Amyraut responded with his first work on the subject, his brief treatise on predestination, 1634. This work aroused the wrath of the Reformed world when he expounded a position on election, the extent of the atonement, and universal grace at odds with accepted wisdom. Starting what Bayle described as a kind of civil war among the Protestant divines of France, it soon became clear that Amyraut, heavily influenced by John Calvin, was pursuing a significantly different theological agenda from orthodox theologians like the French John Owen Pierre Dumoulin, but one that was not exposed to many of the biblical objections raised by many then and subsequently. Rooted in a dualistic conception of the divine will, in Deuteronomy 29:29, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, the things which he has revealed belong to us and to our children. Calvin taught that Christ was offered as the Redeemer of the whole world according to God's revealed conditional will, albeit only received by elected believers according to God's hidden absolute will. Notwithstanding the rationally challenging paradox involved, Calvin maintained the doctrines of universal atonement and divine election side by side. Faced by clear biblical evidence for both, he refused to tamper with the scriptural texts. Logic was not allowed to dictate one emphasis at the expense of the other. Typical of his numerous statements on the extent of the atonement, Calvin commented thus on Romans 5:18. Paul makes grace common to all, not because it in fact extends to all, but because it is offered to all. Although Christ suffered for the sins of the world and is offered by the goodness of God without distinction to all men, yet not all receive him. That was a mind-blowing experience for me when, in my early days in Northampton, I read that comment. Unhappy with this kind of dualism, Calvin's rationalistic successor Theodore Beza deleted the universal aspect of Calvin's scheme in favor of limited atonement, which in turn provoked the equally rationalistic Jacob Arminius to delete the particular aspect of Calvin's scheme in favor of conditional election. Unimpressed by either of the two deviants, was a comment that would send ripples in some circles, wouldn't it? Unimpressed by either of the two deviants, Amyraut was persuaded that Calvin's original position alone possessed biblical integrity. For him, the only option was Calvin's authentic Calvinism. Amyraut also insisted that Calvin's view, with its unique mind and heart set, had enormous pastoral and evangelistic advantages. Roger Nicole admits that Calvin's comment on Romans 5:18, quote, comes perhaps closest to providing support for Amyraut's thesis. Even Richard Muller, who would not be too excited by our conference today, admits that, quote, Calvin's teaching was capable of being cited with significant effect by Maurice Amyraut against his Reformed opponents. According to Dr. Van Stam, at a time when Bayesian ultra-orthodoxy had replaced Calvin's balanced biblicism, quote, Amyraut revealed the attraction which the theology of Calvin held for him. He demonstrated this preference in an array of books, in the process proving his familiarity with the writings of this reformer. Amyraut rediscovered Calvin, as it were, and was perhaps the Calvin expert of the day. In any case, Amyraut fell under the spell of Calvin's theology. Thus, historian Philip Benedict, who incorrectly imagines the canons of Dort to represent a higher orthodoxy than is the case, and lots of people who say they're five-point Calvinists and they follow Dort, they never read them. Don't know what they actually say, but David will be touching on that in his paper. So, Professor Benedict recognizes Amyraut's position in France accurately when he says that, quote, the theologians of the Academy of Saumur consciously opposed Beza and appealed to Calvin instead. In effect, they reversed the steps that had been taken in the passage from Calvin to Calvinism, or Bezaism. Amyraut's impeccable, authentic Calvinist orthodoxy did not shield him from the charge of Arminianizing heresy, even though he claimed an orthodoxy consistent with the canons of Dort. He, with his fellow pastor Paul Testard of Blois, who had also published a similarly heretical piece, was tried and acquitted at the National Synod of Alençon of 1637. The controversy was to rumble on for decades, not only in France but throughout Europe and beyond. Even today, ultra-orthodox blood pressure is often raised when anyone dares to defend and expound the tenets of Moïse Amyraut. Sadly, for most students of French church history, knowledge of Amyraut is confined to his theological notoriety. Mention his name, Amyraldi, is like a swear word in some circles. So since these theological issues are discussed in depth elsewhere, we will continue to explore the less familiar features of Amyraut's life. Returning home from the Synod of Alençon, all Saumur rejoiced at Amyraut's acquittal. The academy flourished for many years, with many students attending from all parts of France and beyond. Indeed, the Saumur Academy became the premier institution of its kind. Amyraut's personal reputation grew with the years, not least among the Roman Catholics. As we have noted, the king's chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, greatly admired him. What is striking is the way Amyraut maintained his reformed convictions without compromise. Surrounded, as the reformed community in France was, by a large and not always benign Roman Catholic majority, tensions were not always easy to handle, even during the golden years. That's from the period 1629 to 1661, when Louis XIV began to reign in his own name. However, in the true spirit of the gospel, Amyraut avoided the extremes of social hostility and a servile ecumenism. He demonstrated this when, to ingratiate himself at Rome, the cardinal advanced a scheme to unite the Roman and Reformed communions in France. He commissioned the Jesuit Father Audebert to sound out the Reformed pastors. Intending to engage in talks with Amyraut, the Jesuit visited Saumur. Brought together by the king's lieutenant, Monsieur Villeneuve, Father Audebert soon discovered that Amyraut was quite inflexible. Regarding unity, the latter declared that this was a thing more to be wished than hoped for, that the opinions of both were so opposite that there was no probability nor possibility of concerting and adjusting them. When the Jesuit indicated that the Roman Catholics were ready to abandon the invocation of saints, the merit of good works, purgatory, and papal supremacy, Amyraut was not to be taken in. These concessions were too few if they did not include the doctrine of the real presence in the Mass. At this point, the Romanists refused to yield. We'll make these other concessions, but we keep the real presence in the Mass. Amyraut concluded the discussion insisting that without this, any unity was mere vanity. And it still is today. Doctrinal debate over the doctrines of grace involved Amyraut in further controversy in the 1640s. When the English Arminian Samuel Hord, rector of Morton in Essex, published an attack on predestination, the impact of the work was also felt in France. Just as the English proto-Amyraldian John Davenant replied to Hord, so did Amyraut. It is fascinating to discover that both authors did not refute Hord from a Bayesian perspective. They were conscious of doing so as authentic Calvinists. Amyraut could not have been more explicit in calling his reply a defense of the doctrine of Calvin. And there's the title page on the right-hand panel of the display there. Armstrong states that in this work, quote, Amyraut clearly identifies his own teaching with that of Calvin. Of all his writings, this is the most important in demonstrating the distinctives of Amyraldianism as compared to the scholastic orientation of the Orthodox. Persisting in the same stance that produced the heresy trial at Alençon in 1637, it was inevitable that Amyraut's critics would try to make more trouble for him at the next National Synod at Charenton in 1644-5. They were normally held in December, and they went over into January. As before, all attempts to discredit him proved fruitless. Doubtless influenced by Amyraut's criticisms of Islam in his first major work, which will be the subject of the next paper, this synod drew up a liturgy for receiving converted Muslims, a baptismal liturgy, into membership of the Reformed churches. And I've quoted from that in my new booklet on Islam, which is there on the table. This synod provides us with a glimpse of Amyraut's magnanimous nature when he defended his Saumur colleague Joshua de Laplace's views over the doctrine of imputed guilt. Properly speaking, Amyraut defended his friend's right to hold such a view, which again can claim some degree of precedent in Calvin, even though he did not actually share it. He simply did not consider it sufficiently fundamental to dispute about publicly, and his eloquence won the day. More important to his ongoing ministry among the churches, Amyraut was asked to write a paraphrase or commentary on the Bible. He commenced this in 1644 with his commentary on Romans. Eventually, he covered all the epistles, the Acts of the Apostles, the Gospel of John. He died before attempting a harmony of the Gospels. Like Calvin, he declined to do anything on the book of Revelation. Personal tragedy hit the Amyrauts in 1645 when their only daughter died at the age of 19. To comfort his distressed wife, Amyraut wrote his treatise on the state of believers after death. Not initially intended for publication, it was only printed when others, impressed by the therapeutic quality of the work, urged him to do so. Published in 1646, it was translated into English and German. In this work, Amyraut the theologian was also Amyraut the pastor. Combining faithful exegesis with deep sympathy, he was able to minister effectively to the bereaved. Amyraut was remarkable for the way he combined academic concerns and pastoral compassion. Many besides his students sought his wise solutions to their intellectual and personal perplexities. The Roman Catholics of Saumur knew that when students of their college had disputes with those of the Reformed Academy, they could rely on Amyraut to be a reliable umpire. He was famous for his philanthropy to the poor, irrespective of religious affiliation. When the local monastery was burned down, the friars asked him to approach Monsieur Hervard, the king's controller of revenue, who happened to be a reformed man. And by the way, that was not accidental. You could always trust a Huguenot with the money. The others were rather doubtful. And this approach was made to help with rebuilding costs. Quick tells us, quote, that the begging friars could be sure to knock at his doors, for they never missed of a good alms, their knapsacks being well filled. And he would tell them pleasantly that he gave them candles, that they might read more and study better. Quick provides a challenging and beautiful picture of Amyraut, the model pastor. The poor of both religions loved and reverenced him as their common father, for he distributed his charity indifferently among them all. But yet he had a most particular concern for the sick, and how many and urgent soever his businesses were, they should never dispense with him from visiting them on their beds of languishing, and ministering spiritual physic, counsels and comfort suitable to their conditions and inward circumstances. He evaded not this office and service of love, neither for the sultry heats of the day, nor for the storms and bitter colds of the night. He hath quitted his own bed and reposed to console dying persons. As we discover the gracious character of Moïse Amyraut, it is important to repeat that he always maintained his Reformed convictions without compromise. For him, a compassionate heart and a sound head were not, as is often the case today, mutually exclusive. So easy to be cold and clinical, isn't it, on one hand, and soft and sentimental on the other. You get kindness from one, clarity from the other, but seldom do the two meet. Well, they did meet in Amyraut. He proved this in June 1646, when by order of the Privy Council, during the Roman Catholic festival of Corpus Christi, the Reformed families of Saumur were ordered to hang tapestries from their balconies as the idolatrous procession passed along the streets of the town. For Amyraut, this situation was a test case for Reformed fidelity. Responding to the instructions of the seneschal, the chief judge of the city, that Amyraut should direct the Protestant people to obey the order, we see evidence of old-fashioned Calvinist courage. Quick's account reveals something of the drama and tension involved. You see, the Reformed and the Romans were living jowl by jowl. The Puritans were troubled by the Church of England, but, at least the Church of England was Protestant. Quick's account reveals something of the drama and tension involved. He goes on. Amyraut had indeed always preached up subjection unto the higher powers. But then it was in those matters in which conscience was not interested or concerned. That he was so far from exhorting his flock to yield obedience in this case, that he would go immediately unto every house of the Reformed, and particularly charge them not in the least to obey this wicked order, nor in any wise to yield the least consent to it, whatever they might suffer for it, and that he would be the first to give them an example and pattern of steadfastness and constancy and patience in their religion. And what he said he did. Monsieur Amyraut was as good as his word, for he was not a reed shaken by the wind, but fixed and immovable in his holy purpose and resolutions as a rock. He therefore quits the high priest's hall, the seneschal's house, and goes from house to house, admonishing and warning all his flock not to have to do in any wise with this idolatry. And they carried, the mass on the shoulders of priests as they made this procession. So he admonished them not to have anything to do with this idolatry. God's glory and the everlasting salvation of their precious souls were now at stake. They should quit themselves as men, as the ancient saints of God had done before them, rather than suffer than sin, burn in the furnace, than bow the knee to the king's golden image or impious decree. Such was the example of one decried as the grave digger of the French Reformed Church. The Corpus Christi episode illustrates the dilemma constantly facing the Huguenots. In their obedience to the word of God, they always sought to fear God and honor the king, which is what the Apostle Peter says in 1 Peter 2:17. In matters not involving religious conformity, they endeavored to be model subjects. Thus far, they were happy to be politically correct. However, should the king command anything contrary to their consciences as Reformed Christians, Peter's bold stand was theirs also. We ought to obey God rather than men. Acts 5:29. As Amyraut's behavior made clear, the Huguenot was guided by Christian correctness, a stance which in no way could properly be construed as revolutionary. Such was the influential teaching expounded in the final chapter of Calvin's Institutes, while leaving room for the legitimacy of popular magistrates in their public capacity to, says Calvin, curb the tyranny of kings. The duty of private Christians is to prove our obedience to them, whether in complying with edicts or in paying tribute, paying our taxes, and cooperating in other civil matters. Faced by royal tyranny, private men must recognize that, says Calvin, the Lord takes wonderful vengeance on unbridled domination. And I believe there is a faint prophetic echo of the French Revolution of 1789, when on the Most High vindicated his suffering servants after nearly 3 centuries of persecution in that terrible revolution. So Calvin says, our obligation is, quote, to obey and suffer. A faithful exegete of the Word of God, Calvin clearly had a high view of kingship. Citing 1 Peter 2:17 and Proverbs 24:21, he states that under the term honor, the Apostle Peter includes a sincere and candid esteem. And Solomon, by joining the king with God, shows that he is invested with a kind of sacred veneration and dignity. Even when rulers are unjust, this feeling of reverence and even of piety we owe to the utmost of our rulers, be their characters what they may. That's Calvin. Where would you place him politically? But he's expounding the Scripture. This teaching explains why, after the execution of King Charles I in 1649, Huguenots like Amyraut distanced themselves from the English Puritan regicides. Agreeing with Calvin, Amyraut published his discourse, The Sovereignty of Kings, in 1650. At a time when the political heritage of the United Kingdom, that's for us now, is fast becoming an anything goes, politically correct democratic tyranny, no less hostile to Christians than the monarchical tyrannies of old, the teaching of Calvin and Amyraut is worthy of sober reflection today. Surely the ultimate issue is not monarchy versus democracy, but the value consensus shared by both the governors and the governed within society, whatever theory of government operates at any one time. In other words, you might have an absolute Christian Reformed monarch presiding over a non-democratic society. I think we would opt for that, wouldn't we, more than a parliamentary democracy that hated Christian faith and ethics? Just a thought to stimulate you there. Whatever the theory of government we might be under. Because of the religious affinities between the Huguenots and the Puritans, especially the Presbyterians, the English Civil War created problems in France. Reformed believers were suspected of fomenting revolution against established order. Unlike England, France had already endured the 16th century wars of religion, and for Amyraut and his generation, the terrible siege of La Rochelle, 1627-8, in which Cardinal Richelieu crushed Protestant political power in France forever, was very recent history. In another work, An Apology for Those of the Reformed Religion, Amyraut took the view that for all that was noble in Huguenot resistance to royal tyranny, just religious grievances were too often mixed up with dubious politics. And that, one fears, has a certain echo regarding Northern Ireland and other places. These issues were brought into sharp focus during the civil disturbances in France known as the War of the Fronde, 1648-53. Succeeding Cardinal Richelieu on his death in 1642, and Louis XIII died the following year, Cardinal Mazarin's unpopular rule was challenged by the Paris Parlement, which sought to limit royal power during the minority of Louis XIV. He was born in 1638, the young king, and Daillet actually refers to the birth of the young king in one of his sermons, I think on Colossians of that year. The revolt being suppressed by the Duke of Condé, he himself led a rebellion in 1650, which ended 3 years later. The entire conflict was civil rather than religious, being doubtless influenced by events in England. So when Condé used his Protestant ancestry to gain Huguenot support in 1651, he was disappointed. Amyraut and his brethren preached obedience to the young king. Their allegiance was considered decisive. Count Harcourt summed up the situation when he declared to the deputies of Montauban, "The crown was tottering on the king's head, but you have steadied it." Returning from banishment, Cardinal Mazarin was no less grateful to, he called the Huguenots, a little flock. In 1652, Louis expressed appreciation for Huguenot support. Our subjects aforesaid of the pretended Reformed religion have afforded us sure proofs of their affection and faithfulness, wherewith we are much pleased. The king also promised to guarantee the Huguenot privileges granted in the Edict of Nantes. Thus the Huguenots rejoiced. Unlike the English Puritans, they had few misgivings about royalty. And at that time, there was no reason to suspect that young Louis would one day become a monster persecutor. He was just a lad in his teens. However, from 1656 onwards, Louis began to exhibit signs of a change of heart and an intolerant absolutist disposition, which eventually led to the terrible dragonnades of 1681 and the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. And it was the Jesuit councillors that were the trouble. And all through the later decades of persecution, the Huguenots amazingly affirmed their loyalty to the king, but they complained about his councillors. Perhaps a rosy view, but nonetheless that was their take on everything. Amyraut became closely involved with the events of these tumultuous times. In January 1651, the royal court came to Saumur. According to custom, there was great pressure on the Reformed community to alter their weekly worship routine during the first 3 days of the royal visit. Amyraut was prepared to be accommodating on the understanding that their normal Lord's Day services would take place as usual. John Quick provides a fascinating account of what happened next. The king came to Saumur the Monday night, and there was no sermon on Wednesday. But on the next Lord's Day, the whole service was performed as usual. Monsieur Amyraut preached in the afternoon. The king was just then got into his majority, actually his 14th year, and together with several young lords, walked out onto the tennis court, which was near adjoining unto the temple of the Reformed. They called their buildings, by the way, temples. They weren't allowed to call their buildings churches because the only church was the Roman Catholic Church. So they were tolerated. They called their buildings temples, which underlined a very important distinction too, because for the Huguenot people, the church is the people. So the church worshipped in the temple. So here we have this situation. Imagine it. Here is the Reformed temple, and adjacent to it is the tennis court. The king, together with several young lords, walked out onto the tennis court, which was near adjoining unto the temple of the Reformed. The Protestants were then singing the psalm, perhaps the one we sang this morning. The king, being a perfect stranger to this action and melody, demanded the meaning of it. Somebody answered it was part of the religious worship of the Huguenots. "Let's go in," said the king, "and see what they're doing." But some great ones then about him obstructed his resolution and conducted him to his sports and divertissements. One wonders what might have transpired in the soul of young Louis XIV had he come under the ministry of Moïse Amyraut. One of those ifs of history. Quick continues, whilst the king was engaged in his play, some of the courtiers had the curiosity to get into the temple and the patience to tarry out the whole sermon. Monsieur Amyraut preached upon those words of St. Peter, "Fear God, honor the king," 1 Peter 2:17. When the action was ended, they declared their great satisfaction one to another and commended the preacher highly as a man of singular merit and eloquence. They went directly from the temple to the racket court and acquainted his majesty with that excellent discourse of the Huguenot minister. Yea, and at night, when her majesty the Queen Mother sat at the table, she was recreated with the punctual relation of it. Surprise at Amyraut's preaching is not difficult to explain. Roman Catholic propaganda created the impression that the Huguenots were a perpetual threat to church and state. It's a bit like David Blunkett saying these evangelicals, they're like these terrorists. That kind of, falsehood. Confronted by the reality of Huguenot piety, those in a position to judge for themselves were able to draw a different conclusion. After arriving at Saumur the following week, even Cardinal Mazarin heard about the sermon and wanted to meet the preacher. Meeting at the cardinal's lodgings, the two men sat by the fire and talked. When Amyraut assured Mazarin of Huguenot support for the king, the cardinal was surprised and charmed at the manners and wisdom of the Reformed pastor. A day or two later, while the king was on a hunting trip, the cardinal visited the nearby abbey of St. Bennet. On returning from his walk, which provided a panoramic view of Saumur, he asked his host, the Count of Comminges, where the Reformed Academy was. Pointing it out in the distance, the cardinal then wished to call on Amyraut. I should mention that many of the characters in the history are included, of course, in Alexandre Dumas' Three Musketeers. It's that sort of era, or rather the sequel, 20 years after. Welcomed at the college gate, he was invited to inspect the library by Amyraut. They discussed the Edict of Nantes and the perpetual obligation of the kings of France to honour it. News of this encounter was the talk of the town. Many were asking what the cardinal and the professors discussed. They did not discuss theological differences on this occasion, as Amyraut later made clear. The Count of Guillot said to the Queen Mother that had they discussed religion, the cardinal would have more than met his match in Monsieur Amyraut. Clearly, the court and the cardinal were impressed by the piety, learning, and integrity of Amyraut. However, while they could not dismiss the Reformed faith, time was to prove that their hearts remained hostile to the gospel, thus adorned by Amyraut and his brethren. In the meantime, the Reformed churches continued to flourish, and the pastors enriched one another by periodic fellowship. In 1653, Jean d'Aillet called at Saumur on his way from Paris to La Rochelle to ordain his son Adrien at the Reformed temple. Quick reminds us that since their student days, Amyraut and d'Aillet had remained dear friends. Regarded as the greatest French preacher since Calvin, d'Aillet had fully supported his friend in his theological conflicts. Both men owed so much to their benefactor, the Lord du Plessis-Mornay. During this meeting, they enjoyed rich fellowship as guests of the godly noble lord's grandson, Lord de Villeneuve, at his chateau in Lower Poitou. We may imagine the joys thus shared in the great hall of the chateau. Quick says that, quote, their discourses and conversation together did ravish and charm that religious family and all the guests and strangers that had the happiness to be their auditors. Quick also supplies a vivid and charming picture of student life at Saumur. He tells us that it was a constant custom with Monsieur Amyraut in the summer evenings to walk in the fields about Saumur, especially after supper. He was always attended with some 60 or 80 students in divinity, who propounded to him all those difficulties and knotty objections which occurred to them in their private studies. We can imagine the cut and thrust of provocative yet good-humored discussion as professor and students fired questions at one another. Quick stresses the importance of these nocturnal excursions. We can imagine Amyraut saying to the students, right, I'll race you to the next tree, and the first one to get there can put the next question. Quick says about all this, these exercises did highly improve those young divines in knowledge, judgment, acumen, and ability to defend the truth and refute errors. And many of them afterwards proved the most eminent ministers of the gospel and victorious champions of our holy religion against all the subtle popish aggressors. And it was these evening walks which occasioned the publication of sundry theological dissertations which he emitted at diverse times from the press into the open world, and which otherwise might have been buried in the graves of perpetual silence. And these were translated, and Baxter commended them in his own works. In the sharp winter of 1657, Amyraut had a bad fall after leaving the temple. Carried home in great agony, he was thought to have broken his thigh. All were gravely concerned, including the Roman Catholics, and fear was expressed for his life. As soon as he recovered from shock, says Quick, he began to speak and comfort those that attended him, telling them that if the Lord should vouchsafe him that favour as to enjoy the benefit of his tongue and understanding to edify his brethren to the last of his life, he should account this the happiest providence which had ever befallen him. Amyraut had actually suffered a hip location and torn ligaments. He was out of action for 6 months, during which time he attended to his voluminous correspondence, continuing also with his paraphrase on the Acts of the Apostles. Becoming more mobile with the aid of crutches, he was carried from place to place in a sedan chair. At the end of August, accompanied by his daughter-in-law, he visited the small town of Bourbon in Burgundy, famous for its attractive vista of the Loire Valley. During his stay, many Reformed believers gathered in his apartment on the Lord's Day for worship, ministry, and fellowship. They were edified, says Quick, by his excellent and fruitful sermons. One sermon in particular was highly valued. Finding relief from the Eau de Bourbon, waters of Bourbon, he drew parallels between the healing effect of the waters and the grace of God in the gospel. Making their way to Paris, Amyraut and his daughter-in-law were welcomed by Monsieur Hervard, I've mentioned him earlier, the Reformed Royal Controller of Revenue, at whose residence they stayed for 3 months. The Princess of Tarente, the godly daughter of the Huguenot Duc de la Force, enjoyed their company and especially Amyraut's discussions on theological and devotional matters. Frequently appearing at the great temple in Charenton, he preached sermons on the glory of Christ and the work of the Holy Spirit, and they were published. Learning from Monsieur Hervard that Amyraut was in town, Cardinal Mazarin welcomed a further opportunity to speak with the Reformed professor. When they first met, the cardinal's position during the Fronde had been much less secure. Always impressed by Amyraut's personal integrity and learning, and recalling with pleasure his visit to the Reformed Academy and its library, the cardinal now invited the Huguenot to see his house and library. While relations were respectful and even cordial, it should be remembered that synodical assemblies of the Reformed churches could only be approved by the government. During another visit, having been asked by the Reformed Consistory of Paris to petition the cardinal to authorize a new national synod, Amyraut duly approached him on the subject. Suspicions about Reformed influence always lurking in the background, matters were never plain sailing. However, the cardinal, urging Amyraut to be patient, invited him to put the request in writing, which he did. Permission for the National Synod of Loudun was eventually granted. It was to prove the final synod ever allowed by Louis XIV, as he increasingly pursued a Jesuit-inspired policy to exterminate the Reformed churches of France. Indeed, the king and his advisers had good reason to respect Huguenot resolve. When the synod commenced by His Majesty's permission on the 10th of January 1659, the king's commissioner demanded that the Huguenots should be more submissive to His Majesty and less antagonistic to the Church of Rome. The synod moderator, the illustrious Monsieur Jean d'Aillet, rose to the occasion. While he affirmed the loyalty and submission of the Reformed churches to the king as next under God in all things lawful, he refused to dilute their theological stance. He bravely affirmed that, quote, as to those words Antichrist found in our liturgy, and idolatry and deceit of Satan found in our confession of faith, they be words declaring the grounds and reasons of our separation from the Romish Church, and doctrines which our fathers maintained in the worst of times, going back to the Bartholomew Massacre, for example, and which we are fully resolved as they, through the aids of divine grace, never to abandon, but to keep faithfully and inviolably to the last gasp. It is interesting to note that John Quick was writing his biography of Amyraut in 1696, 11 years after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Looking back wistfully, he wrote of the Synod of Loudun, I pray God it may not be their last, it being 36 years since it was broken up on the 10th of January 1660, and the churches in that kingdom are all ruined and desolate. The next synod was planned for Nîmes in 1662-3, but it was never to be. However, according to the amazing providence of the wonderful numberer, that's what John Quick calls the Lord, the wonderful numberer with a capital N. And 9 years after Quick's death, in 1706, the next took place in the Cevennes in 1715, the very year Louis XIV died. But that is another and happier story. I mustn't get sidetracked into that. We're drawing the conclusion now of our look at Amyraut. It is appropriate here to mention that synods had a vital place in the life of the Reformed churches of France. Respectful and courteous to both Anglican and Roman Catholic churchmen, they remained committed to Reformed faith and order. Indeed, the Huguenots were as tenacious over their order as they were over their faith. Amyraut believed with Calvin and Beza that according to clear New Testament teaching, elder and bishop were terms relating to one and the same individual, as surely as elder and deacon denoted quite different roles. He also taught that each church should be governed by a plural body or council of elders, what they call the consistory, and that this was made up of ministers of the word and ruling elders. Showing little sympathy for congregational independency, he also believed that synods had divine warrant, based on Acts 15. They enabled churches to express connectional fellowship and solidarity. However, while French Reformed Church orders stated that provincial synods were to be subordinate to national synods, it was only self-subordination. One could say that French Reformed order was really a kind of a middle ground between Anglo-Scottish Presbyterianism and Congregationalism. I'll explain why. By referring to their churches in plural terms, their approach was bottom-up rather than top-down, as in the Presbyterian Church singular hierarchical system. And that's why John Milton complained that new presbyteries but old priests writ large. Amyraut had already published a work on church order before the National Synod of Loudun. At the synod, he was commissioned to prepare a treatise showing the conformity of the discipline of the Reformed churches of France with the ancient primitive church. Dying before this work was finished, it was completed by his pupil Mathieu Larocque, minister of Quevilly near Rouen, whose treatise was later translated into English. And if you want a copy of that original 1691 text, I can let you have it, along with some others. As in England, where Anglicans regarded non-episcopally ordained Puritans as not true ministers, so the French Roman Catholic clergy dismissed the orders of the Huguenot ministers. Ever concerned to combine courtesy with tenacity, Amyraut put his theory of church order to good use. When Monsieur Périfix, Archbishop of Paris, visited Saumur, he requested a meeting with Amyraut. Knowing the scriptural prohibition against bishops being lords, 1 Peter 5:3, Amyraut refused to address Roman Catholic bishops as my lord, unless they were peers of the realm, itself an arrangement the Huguenots were hardly in a position to correct. Once the archbishop, not being a peer, realized he would only be addressed as Mr., he agreed to an unofficial private meeting with Amyraut. He wanted a rather flamboyant public meeting. While he was quite a civil man, he was possibly tinged with jealousy where the Parisian preacher Jean Daillet was concerned. Quick's revealing report is not without a touch of humor. They spent together in that conversation about 3 hours, discoursing of the affairs of the great world and the most eminent persons for learning and religion in the communion of both churches. This led them into a discourse of Monsieur Daillet, a person of extraordinary parts and famous for his profound knowledge in the learned world. Monsieur Amyraut observed that the archbishop always spoke of him slightingly and by the single name of Daillet, which made Monsieur Amyraut never to mention him, his friend, without a preface and title of honor. My godly, highly esteemed, greatly blessed brother, Jean Daillet. So the difference was so marked. He made something of it, and yet he just called the archbishop Mr. We have thus noticed that in those tense and potentially explosive times, Amyraut was concerned to combine tenacity of conviction with courtesy and compassion. A beautiful example of the latter occurred in 1662, 2 years before he died. Following a bad harvest that year, there was a great shortage of corn in France. Due to her wise management, Madame Amyraut had, Joseph-like, stocked up large reserves of corn at their country house in the Vale of Anjou. Says Quick, she had stacked it up in the barns and fields for sundry years of plenty, together most abundantly. They were urged to take financial advantage of the situation by selling the corn, obviously at inflated prices. The Amyrauts refused to follow what they construed as selfish and ungodly advice. Instead, while taking prudent care of his family and servants, should bad harvests continue, they drew up a plan to distribute the corn freely to the poor, irrespective of religious persuasion. Observing Paul's directive to do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith, Galatians 6:10, first the Reformed poor, then the Roman Catholic poor benefited from their gracious generosity. Quick writes that the Roman Catholics, whose hungry bellies and empty bowels were refreshed by him, loved and honored him, calling him the common father of the poor, declaring that in his charities he made no distinction between them and those of his own religion. At the commencement of the September vacation in 1663, the Amyrauts retired to their country house as usual. Within days, Moise became unwell, developing a high but intermittent fever, what was known as ague years ago. Instead of returning to Saumur for medical help, he stayed to enjoy a well-deserved rest. After several weeks, his condition deteriorating, Amyraut bowed to the inevitable and returned to Saumur. Concern for his health grew, and the sad news spread rapidly. Many anxious visitors called to see him, Roman Catholics as well as Reformed people. As his end drew near, he testified of his faith to a captive audience crowded around his bed. So moving were his last hours that Quick referred to Amyraut's deathbed utterances in a later funeral sermon. He did so to prove the dying man's fidelity to the Reformed faith to the last. Says Quick, he proved the truth of the Christian religion and of our holy Reformed religion by many unanswerable arguments. This I have professed, said Amyraut. I have preached this holy Reformed religion well nigh 40 years, and turning himself unto the papists, for there were many then present in his chamber, spectators and witnesses of his last end. Gentlemen, said he, this is the only true religion, and out of it there is no salvation. That God to whom I am going knows that I do speak the very truth. This and much more he uttered with a clear and audible voice, yea, and those very papists heard him with much reverence and attention. He lingered several days, during which time many of his flock received their beloved pastor's final exhortations. Quick adds this further moving information. He had advised them to stand steadfast in the faith, to hold fast to their profession without wavering, and to prepare against the evil times of sore trials which were approaching. For the God of judgment was at the door, and heavy judgments would begin at the house of God. And therefore, how painful soever their cross and sufferings might be, they should not faint, nor prevaricate in, nor apostatize from their holy religion. For he protested to them in the presence of God, to whose tribunal he was now a-going, that it was the only true one in the whole world, and that out of it there was no salvation to be obtained. I say, after he had given them these and a great many other divine counsels, he blessed them in the name of the Lord. The dying servant of God clearly foresaw the coming persecutions which afflicted the Reformed churches of France 2 decades later. He has sufficient strength to repeat some of these exhortations to another pastor from Poitou, who, passing through Saumur and hearing that Amyraut was dying, called to see him. Encouraging his rather diffident brother, Amyraut said, "The doctrine I have taught my scholars in the university and my church in the city is the very truth of God, by which we must all be saved." After giving his son directions about his will, Amyraut said farewell to his wife and family. Quick describes his last moments thus: in the 15 last moments of his life, he joined his hands together and lifted them up with his eyes unto heaven, waiting as dying Jacob did for God's salvation, and in that posture breathed out his blessed soul into the arms of his Redeemer. And so this honored servant of Christ died on the 18th of January, 1664, aged 68 years. His dearly beloved wife, and they were obviously deeply in love, who also became ill during her husband's sickness, survived him only by a few months. Their son, whose own son Moses eventually settled here in England, met John Quick in London after escaping to England at the time of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Quick describes him, that is Amyraut's son, as a man of serious piety, being an illustrious confessor of our Lord Jesus in these woeful times of tribulation. He later served as an advocate in the High Court of Justice in The Hague, after presenting an engraving of his father to one of the greatest of Amyraut's pupils, Pierre Dubosc, minister of the Reformed Church at Caen in Normandy, and described by Louis XIV as the greatest orator in France. He added, that is, Pierre Dubosc added to this engraving, a personal Latin tribute to his professor. Thus translated, this worthy epitaph reads, "From Moses down to Moses none among the sons of men with equal lustre ever shone in manners, tongue, and pen." Is it any wonder that Richard Baxter should be impressed by this man whose books he so much admired? Indeed, is it so dubious a privilege, after all, to be dubbed an Amyraldian? Thank you for your attention.